speaker, Dr. Max Moritz. He is a cooperative extension wildfire specialist for the University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. He's also an adjunct professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara and an affiliate of the Earth Research Institute. His research focuses on understanding the dynamics of fire regimes at relatively broad scales, and his extension work involves applying this information to planning, management, and policy relevant to fire-prone landscapes. So Max, take it away.
I'm going to turn my camera off in a second because our bandwidth is bad here, but I wanted to continue the pattern of saying thank you to the organizers, and Denise in particular, to the previous speakers who have given some really interesting talks. And also, I'm honored to be here celebrating Carla, who I'm happy to consider a colleague, a role model, and a friend. All right. I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about where and how we live on fire-prone landscapes. So I'm going to start it off with some fire science, fire ecology related research to say why I've been motivated to move in this direction. But it's kind of obvious. We have what we see on this intro screen here is becoming more and more common. The top is from the Angora fire around Tahoe about 15 years ago, and the bottom is the result of the Camp Fire in Paradise just a few years ago. But this increasing pattern of home loss and fatalities that we're seeing, and what can we possibly do to get a handle on it? Because fires come out of our wildlands and impact us as people, and then we are often the start of many of these fires, kind of emerging from our communities and affecting the fire ecology of these systems. If you've done any study or seen talks on fire, you've probably seen the fire behavior triangle. Basically, if you want to understand the flame lengths or rates of spread or frequencies of a given fire, it's often boiled down to weather, fuel, and topography. But over longer time scales and broader spatial scales, Carla showed a slide somewhat like this. Fire sweeps across the planet every year in different months, and some years are different than others. But looking at the fire patterns like this, fire regimes, leads to a different set of questions and a different set of insights. And that's what I've actually spent most of the last 2 decades working on. From that work, we've kind of come up with 3 bins of controls on fire regimes. So the sets of variables that control fuel amount first. So productivity, plant productivity, really. What are the biophysical variables that make one environment more productive and fuel to accumulate faster than another? And those are different variables in different environments. The fire season, there has to be a length of time in which whatever is on the ground, whatever biomass there is actually flammable. So there's another set of variables that control the length and severity of that window, promoting flammability. And then you have to have ignitions that coincide with these to actually have recurring fire. And I've spent a lot of time at broad scales doing this, but when we've zoomed into California and started trying to do this, what we see here is about 50 years of fire in the little orange blobs over the ecoregions of California. When you zoom into finer scales, you start to realize that those bioclimatic variables don't necessarily tell the whole story anymore. So we've built a bunch of fire models for CAL FIRE, and they actually use these as the model of record in some of their programs. We realized you cannot leave people out of these analyses. You have to include patterns of things like the power line infrastructure across the state, other anthropogenic variables like road network, the housing densities, and so on, all have to go into the models, or we don't get the patterns right. And we've learned a lot. Some of the more interesting things that we've learned is that you can break the sensitivity of fire activity on the landscape through the models. You can break it into the natural biophysical variables. And this is a map showing kind of the partial dependence of fire activity to the biophysical variables. And then in the model, you can segregate and isolate, bin the anthropogenic, the human-related variables. And you learn some really interesting things. One is that in many parts of the landscape up and down the state, the human variables are as strong or stronger than the biophysical variables affecting fire activity. And it's also, it can be a positive or a negative effect. And that's because we actually can increase ignitions or we can decrease fire for various reasons. And this is one of the model results. This is a sort of a functional response curve of fire activity, how strong the effect is on fire activity. The variable being on the x-axis, mean housing density. So we see that there is this hump-shaped and probably very general response that fire activity has to housing densities. And the way to interpret this is there's some background level of fire at very low housing densities, right? And then as you sprinkle homes onto a landscape, you increase ignitions, increase fire activity. And then you continue to develop, and finally you've fragmented up the landscape. There's not as much, as many expanses of flammable native vegetation. And then finally you're out here in these very high densities and you're in a very urban environment where, you've got organized fire suppression and fire just doesn't play as strong a role. But this effect shows us something that we can do with policy, right? Where and how we build our communities on the landscape defines our exposure to fire, right? And how likely it is that fires are going to hit those developed areas. But it also feeds back to affect fire frequencies themselves. So actually, as we wrestle with climate change, we also have a really important lever through landscape and urban planning to affect not only our exposure and our risk, but also future fire frequencies. I spent a fair amount of time, and this took me into an area that I have less comfort as a researcher and scientist because I'm not an urban planner. I'm not a landscape architect, but there's a real gap in the literature about how can you build new communities to make them more survivable? What are the things that we have learned from research, which actually there's not a lot out there, and from other countries, largely Australia, to help us do this better in the future? Couple of just real simple examples that came from interviews with planners and fire professionals. When you're building a new community, don't put homes on the outer perimeter road of the development. Pack them into the interior so that you have a sidewalk, a full street width, a sidewalk, and a yard before you actually, before the fire coming from outside this community hits a structure. Simple, but hard to actually get developers to do unless you're very strong about encouraging or stipulating it. Instead of typical urban sprawl, like we see in this panel, the rectangular gridded neighborhood, this cartoon is supposed to be an older traditional neighborhood, but the sprawl has, as this has developed and expanded outward, it's low density, right? It's lower cul-de-sacs, lower, more widely spaced homes, which eats up a lot of this darker native habitat, and it eats up this hatched area, which is supposed to represent farmland, right? In contrast, clustered development could result in the same number of homes, less native habitat eaten up, and more of this agricultural land, which is acting as kind of a buffer against fire, reaching our wildland urban interface, reaching where we live. Now that's for new communities. What about existing communities? And here's where I want to talk about this regional wildfire mitigation program, which we've started here locally. There are thousands and thousands of communities out there that are in dire need of some sort of coherent synthetic approach to risk mitigation. And we really do not have one right now that makes a real strong impact. And that's my argument. And this comes from many years of looking at community wildfire protection plans and other communities grappling with these problems. So the regional wildfire mitigation program approach breaks breaks out 3 domains: the landscape, the community, and the built environment. And I'll touch on a little bit of those here and show you some preliminary results from our own program here, which has been funded by NIFWIF. And we have a wide set of partners helping us push this forward. Community wildfire protection plans are what most people think of when they think of risk reduction on the community side. While these are really helpful, they focus mostly on where to put fuel breaks. There is some collaborative effort and there's some mention of structure hardening, but really it's about where to prioritize fuel breaks. And in our backyard, we have 6 community wildfire protection plans. Some of them are very small, just covering, say, Mission Canyon, and another one is at the San Marcos Pass communities, and some of them are larger, like Carp Summerlin, Montecito, Santa Barbara City, Goleta. But these are all uncoordinated or basically disconnected. Some are different sizes, produced at different times, and they don't coordinate or talk to each other in a meaningful way. So our landscape here, if you look at it, we have some interesting patterns here. We've got this kind of lighter green shade over here on the eastern part of our landscape, and then some of that same green and a little bit of this yellow. That's ag. That's the existing ag belt, which has actually saved many of these communities from fire sweeping out of the front country and into those communities. And where that ag is gone or never existed, above Santa Barbara and Montecito primarily, that's where we experience most of our home losses. So with this as sort of our backdrop, we embarked on a regional wildfire mitigation program. The built environment, most people think of structures, and that is a key thing that we're trying to map and analyze. Fire-resistant roofs and siding and well-maintained vegetation is certainly important, but it goes beyond that. It involves the water supplies, the road networks, and the power line infrastructure. All of those contribute to a survivable and relatively fire-resistant built environments. We're basically cataloging and mapping all of that. Ag, here's a picture of some ag down in Ventura that was helpful in stopping, I think, the Thomas Fire. This is, I owe some of these photos to other collaborators. This is from Rob Hazard. Clearly, the ag belt above Santa Barbara, where it is there, it would be nice to lock it down when we're considering it a buffer anyway. The other areas where there is no ag, there's a bunch of other options. There's shaded fuel breaks of coast live oak. That's part of the project that the Botanic Garden is working on. There's irrigated green spaces. There's riparian areas. There's any number of different ways that we can think of a buffer along the Wildland Urban Interface. And we're mapping and trying to understand the best options for that across the front country too. There's people, right? There's the community, getting people plugged into training and education programs. Specifically, we've bought into the Firewise USA program, which after your community becomes recognized, it does have some advantages for several insurance companies. This is from a Ventura exercise after some fires down there. But those are the 3 basic pillars or the 3 domains of the project. We have a methodology. We have a fairly organized and explicit process for each of the domains. We have a pretty sophisticated risk assessment where we do hazard modeling under a variety of different weather conditions, and then use that hazard map, as you'll see in a second, as a basis for understanding what the exposure is of the resources and the values that we have in these 3 domains, what their exposure is, and try to figure out how to map their vulnerabilities and that exposure in a way that gives us some steps toward prioritization of mitigation activities. So the wind data that we're using is simulated from some colleagues at UCSB, Charles Jones and Leila Carvalho. And it takes basically 2 different kinds of sundowner events and makes a composite sundowner as our sort of problem fire, runs it through a fire model, creates a whole, many thousands of surfaces of fire probability and flame lengths and so on. And here's one of the results of that. This is burn probability. And it's looked at through these different watersheds across the front country. And the white, which may be hard to see, that the words in white are our different communities, which we'll actually, we'll see in a second. Those were watersheds, I apologize, or subwatersheds. These are the defined communities we have so far. This will probably evolve somewhat, but these are the communities that we are organizing and trying to plug into Firewise USA. But they're also a useful unit to actually look at exposure, right, to the different levels of fire hazard, which we see in on the colors on the map here. And using some other data, the structure inspection data from Santa Barbara County Fire and some remote sensing data from Mark Mays, one of our key folks on the project, we can look at something like this, which tells us the y-axis here is sort of the greenness. How buffered is each of these communities on a 5-year mean on average? And on the x-axis here, we have something that tells us how fire resistant the roofing it might be. Over here, the same, on the right-hand panel, the same figure, but the x-axis is how fire resistant the siding might be. And the different colors, the darker and darker red, tells us how much exposure to hazard these different communities have, and the size of the dots is the number of homes. So we're starting to get a handle on how we might characterize some of the data. These are preliminary results, which will lead us into the mitigation part, how to prioritize mitigation activities based on what we're finding and where to apply those resources. We also have in the community domain, we've accomplished, I say we, it's Anne Marie Parkinson, who's leading the community domain, and she's an employee of the Fire Safe Council, who's deeply involved in this. The Trout Clubs, the county's first recognized Firewise USA program. So we're very proud that we're actually not just finding some preliminary data and have good funding for this, but we're actually making some progress in getting these communities educated and plugged in. There's a website, rwmpsantabarbara.org, if you want to learn more. Again, the Fire Safe Council is deeply involved. Even though it started outside the Fire Safe Council, and it's very well funded right now from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWF, which funded some of the earlier projects we heard about. As the Fire Safe Council moves forward, we will need to find additional sources and additional partners. Right now, it's it's really a broad collaboration between a whole bunch of different organizations that all deserve credit on getting this going. And it will probably expand as we continue. And so once we've pioneered it here, our hope is that, like Firewise, as it spreads across the country and plugs in more and more communities, we will have regional wildfire mitigation programs popping up and happening in other places, because there's a lot of parts of the West that need some sort of an approach. And so I'm hoping that this is going to fill that need, or partly fill that need. And that's all I had. Okay. Hopefully, if there are any questions, I would do my best.
Max, where are you? Can you pull up your video?
Where am I? I'm in my messy den.
Oh, sorry. It was really great to loop back around to the people and our communities and like what's that part of the equation. So it's really great to think about. We have one question in the Q&A, and it's a challenging one. You talk about the importance of agricultural areas as buffers against fire spread into residential areas. However, by converting natural to ag lands or maintaining ag lands, you're diminishing native habitats and native plant biodiversity. Agricultural development is often accompanied by the use of biocides, fertilizer, and water, which put further strains on our local environment. Is this such a good idea if you want to maintain native species and biodiversity?
Great, very, very important point. And I don't think any of us are advocating to take large swaths of the front country and turn it into commercial ag, right? That's not, it's not going to happen. There's not enough water for it. But where we do have ag that is going to be there and it's going to be operational, and it's providing a function that is pretty under-recognized and undervalued, I think that we as a society need to think hard about that. And if we can have ag that's less impactful from a, like you're saying, from a pesticide and biodiversity perspective, that's really important. But the fact of the matter is, without that ag there, if we were to let it go, these would be probably kind of weedy, they'd be weedy grasslands, right? And that's not a great option either, because that's neither native habitat, nor is it providing any sort of a buffer against fires coming in and impacting our lives. So it is a trade-off. There are lots and lots of things that are trade-offs that we have to go into with eyes wide open.
Be careful about muting. Yeah, for sure. Here's another one for you, Max. How do you make sure that your research gets translated into policy? And can you give an example of a city planning project that took into account design of Defensible?
Wow, that's painful, but yeah, that's a great question. I think one really good example, one really sad example, is that I worked for probably 3 years on a bill that came out of Hannah Beth Jackson's office, and it got bipartisan support. It finally passed, and then the governor didn't sign it. And it was a really progressive, there's a bunch of reasons why it didn't get signed. But I mean, it had support. It had a lot of people that worked hard on it. So I guess the story there is that it's really tough. It's really, really tough to get research into policy. There's so many barriers that have nothing to do with science, zero. So it's challenging. It's just persistence, perseverance. There is, though, the example of Paradise. When Paradise burned up north and they were rebuilding Paradise, the Parks and Rec department took an active role in trying to buy up some of the parcels that had burned and actually incorporate them into the park system and turn them into more of a buffer, an irrigated green belt, if you will, to help to help protect the town. So it does happen. There's also the Gaviota Coast Plan. If you look at the Gaviota Coast Plan, it's written in there that development should be concentrated on the lowest hazard portion of the landscape, right? And avoid the high hazard part. So there are examples of it happening. It's just not enough.